Good afternoon and good morning. My name's Andrew Gilmore of the Berkhoff Foundation. And a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for our meeting on the brain and peace, and best wishes for a new year that in terms of conflict and lives lost is hardly been a very good start. We at the Berkhoff Foundation here in Berlin are constantly looking within other disciplines to see if our approaches to peacemaking and mediation strategies can become ever more effective. And neuroscience is one of those disciplines, on the surface quite removed from the work we and others do in trying to resolve or transform conflict in many parts of the world. And yet we believe that neuroscience holds great potential for us all and might present some crucial opportunities for reducing conflict. Now, today's event is comprised of a series of highly distinguished and qualified experts, but I will leave our moderator, Carla Schrammel, to introduce them to you. This coming April in Berlin, we are organizing a much larger event called the Berlin Moot Reshaping Peace, which will bring together policymakers and global experts from a wide range of disciplines, together with peace practitioners and mediators to discuss innovative new approaches. And today's meeting is in some ways a preparatory meeting for that Berlin Moot. And it is based, today's meeting, on the logic that neuroscience can better understand peace-building work, thereby, or by reinforcing efforts to create empathy and trust, and the role of stress and trauma and how to assuage those. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and I'm very happy to hand the floor to our moderator, Carla.
In 1978, US President Carter led the negotiations between Egypt and Israel, and he was very convinced that trust building was key to the process. When he shared his analysis with one of his advisors, William Quandt, he commented, "Oh my God, are we going to have a group therapy?" This quote and also these practices may belong to the past. However, I believe it also tells us something about how we in peace building and peace practice deal with the human dimension and the underestimation of the human dimension. This includes transforming relationship, creating trust, creating empathy, and dealing and acknowledging stress and trauma. All this is connected to our brains and how our brains are wired. Welcome to our online event, The Brain and Peace. My name is Carla Schrammel. I'm advisor on mediation negotiation support at Berkhoff, and I have the pleasure to moderate this event. I might have simplified or even oversimplified a little bit how peacemakers are dealing with the human dimension. In peace efforts, in particular involving the communal level and the societal level, there's a long and rich history of taking this into account and of creating trust and transforming relationship. Also in political processes, there's an increasing acknowledgement of this dimension. However, not all the assumptions we are working on are backed up by scientific evidence and tested against evidence. And looking into brain science and their evidences may help to differentiate the assumptions we are working on. And this is actually exactly what we want to do today. We want to explore the human dimension of peace building and peacemaking, and touch upon questions such as, how does the brain work in the situation of conflict? And what are the implications for our peace building and peacemaking practices? The next 40 minutes, I will ask our distinguished panel questions, and then we will open the floor to the audience. Please use the Q&A function. We will pass on as many questions as we can. And with this, I'm happy to turn already to our first speaker, Timothy Phillips, who is the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict. Beyond Conflict actually had a crucial role in advancing new evidence-based strategies to reduce conflict. Tim, you're one of the pioneers, actually, to think brain and peace together. You have been doing so the last 14 years, and you're a very experienced peacemaker. So I would like to invite you to talk to us to the question, what brought you to science, and what did you learn from that? And what may have changed your own practices? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Carla. And I want to thank Andrew as well for this kind introduction and invitation. So let me just start off by saying that, for Beyond Conflict is now about 33 years old as an organization. And for the first 24 years or 22 years, we focused on just sort of the shared experience model of conflict resolution, meaning we would bring people who sat across profound divides in other countries and bring them to another country where people were struggling to imagine what a peace process would look like or how we can move out of a repressive system like apartheid. And we found that this model of shared experience, rooted in this shared human experience that we find around the world, could be valuable over time in a curated way. And about 14 years ago, I was teaching a class at a local university at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And the course was called Conflict Resolution in the 21st Century, the Human Dimension, because I felt we needed to understand more the human experience in conflict, because too many of the theories and approaches, as important as they were missing this element. In every other class, I'd have a speaker come in. In one class, I had Jerry Adams from Northern Ireland come in, who some of you may know was an instrumental leader in the Irish Republican side of the conflict there. And a student raised her hand and asked him, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have killed or tried to kill somebody very close to you? And he paused and he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room. He had been observing the classes. And after this particular class, he came up to me and he said, I've heard these themes of humiliation as today, or empathy, or fear. And, there's a lot of brain behavioral science research on these emotions. And I said, what do you mean the brain side? Because I understood from social psychology or the work I've done, what we've all observed or experienced. And he said something really quite profound and simple. And with the credibility of a man in his 70s who had been a neuroscientist at that stage for over three decades, he said, we are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see them, are understood and valued by others. And it just struck me in one of those aha moments. I thought of it personally, not just in terms of our work. And I pushed him further. I said, what do you mean? He said, we need to focus on how we think as humans and not what we think. Because how we think is so deeply unconscious. Maybe 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. And he says, we go out in the world with all these approaches and strategies and theories anchored in an enlightenment view that humans are fundamentally reason-based beings. But he said, now science is showing us that it's actually just the opposite, that our capacity to even think rationally, to a large extent, is dependent on this unconscious and to a large extent emotionally shaped brain. And if we really want to make progress on a range of human issues, then we need to understand human cognition and emotion. So living here and working in Boston, we have some great universities. And I went on a journey with some of my colleagues in 2010. And we met this brilliant postdoc named Emile Bruneau, who unfortunately passed away from cancer 2 or 3 years ago. And he was in the lab of this brilliant young neuroscientist, Rebecca Sachs. And I said, listen, I'm in this world of conflict resolution and peace building. It's been anchored in the shared human experience. So this is an organic interest. Like, what are we missing? And why would, at that stage, there were so many intractable conflicts in the world or fragile peace agreements? Are we missing something in the human experience that's actually rooted in evidence? And one of the things Emile and Rebecca said at that stage was, here we are at MIT, which is where they were based. We're graduating PhDs in economics and political science who are still taught that humans are fundamentally rational beings. And yet over here in the cognitive sciences, we know it's just the opposite. And it just struck me at that moment that in my field, in our collective field, if we don't understand human cognition and emotion, and if more than 90% or close to 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access, then we are doing a huge disservice to humankind. And so I started, working with Emil and Rebecca. We made Emil our lead scientist. We were sort of bootstrapping this work. We'd have conferences at the MIT Media Lab on neuroscience and social conflict, then one on dehumanization, then norms, narratives, and neurons, and many others. And a few things I'll just say at the outset is one of the first things that Emil and Rebecca said to me when we met, they said, in our research on sort of peace building, conflict resolution, a lot of it's based on contact theory. And they said, so how long in beyond conflict experience does it take for the progress to be made if you're working in a country? How many interventions, how many workshops or meetings or conferences or trips? And I said, it can take years for people to have that sort of, you might call a cognitive shift, and it begins to impact their behavior. And one of the things he pointed out is, and Rebecca, if we could understand the neural mechanisms or the psychological processes that are engaged to either advance positive pro-social change or resist it or mitigate its benefit, then you may take a program that's 3 or 4 years old and get it done in a year. And you can have real evidence-based measures about, what is the nature of social change, and particularly in conflict situations. And so what we started doing with a number of colleagues, including some on this phone, is start bootstrapping this, and I can talk further later, but really bringing this knowledge, this research base, not just from the lab, but with communities and practices around the world.
Thank you very much, Tim. This was a really good start. I think also because it was such a great mix between giving some of the history, right? How Beyond Conflict and other actors were crucially involved, the history of how to think brain and peace together. And I think the quotation which you shared actually is quite impressive and challenge our rational actors model, right? You said, we are in the first line, we are emotionally based beings, and we can only react or act rationally when we are recognized in our identity. I think this is really something to think about. Thank you very much. I think we will have the opportunity also to hear more, and I think also the challenging on questioning of the regional actors model, I think, will come into play and on different occasions throughout the discussion. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our second speaker, who is Michael Niconchuk. He is program lead at Penn Collective, and he is a very experienced practitioner and researcher at exactly the nexus between brain and cognitive science and peace building. And beyond that, Mike is very used also to explain the functioning of the brain to people who are not an expert on this. So I would like you to kick us off with answering to the question, how does the brain work, in particular in the situation of conflict? Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Carla. I think one of the reasons why I have spent so much effort trying to explain how the brain works to lay audiences is because I had to do that for myself. My educational background as an undergraduate was actually in international security studies and classical Arabic, and I only got into the field of neuroscience in a master's degree. So it was part of my own journey in trying to understand the past of my family, the past and present of many of the communities that I was working in as a humanitarian aid and development practitioner. The two questions that have sort of followed me through my career have been, first and foremost, What do we do at this nexus of pain and perpetration? We work in so many contexts, and my mother is from Guatemala, where I was working for many, many years with folks who were combatants during the internal armed conflict that lasted 36 years, and exploring the legacies of my own family's pain and the perpetration that was part of this government rebel sides that took place and that emerged. And so that's what led me into neuroscience, was trying to understand the intergenerational and historical aspects of my own family's journey in trauma and in conflict. So the best way that I can explain the brain in a very short period of time is, first and foremost, to reiterate that the brain is situated in context. The brain is not this mysterious object that sits above the rest of our bodies in some way, shape, or form, beyond the fact that it is simply higher up above the neck. The brain is situated in context, and by that I mean in the context of the body, in the context of our relationships, in the context of culture, and in the context of history. And by history, I mean evolution, but I also mean the history of particular communities. And I strongly encourage folks to engage with some of the cultural neuroscience work that was first piloted by Kitayama and Park in 2010, a seminal paper exploring different constructions and representations of the self in the brain between highly individualistic and highly collectivist societies. The modern field of neuroscience is quite new, but it has its roots all the way back to ancient Egypt, which are some of the first communities that were engaging in cranial scraping and drilling as a way to try to alleviate either brain disorders or mental illness or different things that they deemed as stemming from this cluster of neurons above the neck. And this cluster of neurons above the neck that we have, that we call our brains, it has one job. This is throughout the history of our species and many other species, especially social apes. The job of your brain is not accuracy. Your brain does not care if you have a correct interpretation of the world around you. Its job is to help you stay alive. And to do so, it basically, in this survival orientation, it's constantly trying to accrue resources. And that includes quick biases to be able to react quickly to life-threatening situations or situations that are perceived to be life-threatening. It also is what helps you be able to understand how, to prioritize getting food, water, and shelter. It's also what leads us to form group bonds and in and out groups, because surviving in a group is a lot easier than surviving on your own. And in pursuit of these various survival resources, your body has a budget that it works with of electrical energy, of chemical signals, of different physiological processes that are all turned up and down and directed to different outcomes in service of your survival. And as Tim mentioned, anywhere from 95 to 98% of your brain's functions and activities are not things that you have conscious access to and control over. And that creates a situation where, whether it's in the context of conflict or of trauma, certain biases emerge. And we might find ourselves empathizing more or less with a certain group, depending on how threatened we feel. We might find ourselves physiologically elevated in response to a trigger that reminds us of a traumatic past event. And these are things that are largely below our conscious awareness. And I know that our next speaker will dive very deeply into some of those specific processes that are relevant for conflict.
Yeah, thank you already for this really good transition to our next speaker. But before that, I think I want to acknowledge also what I found particularly interesting, that you emphasized, like the survival focus of our brain. I think this can explain a lot of things. And the other thing is also like the way how you say, and that contextualizing is so important. I think this is really interesting. And in particular, I find interesting that you pointed out that it might be even depending on culture, and that how we reflect ourselves in the brain depends on culture. I think this is really interesting. Thank you so much for that, Michael. And with that, we'll come, as already announced, to our third speaker, who is Veronika Engert. She is professor for social neuroscience at the Institute for Psychotherapy and Psycho-Oncology at the University Hospital in Jena. And Veronika, you have been dedicating a long time of your career also as a neuroscientist to the aspects of trauma, stress, and empathy. So I would like to ask you to share a little bit, what do brain and body tell us about empathy, stress, and trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you for having me. For me, this is really an incredibly important venue and a completely new context to show my work, and I'm extremely pleased to be here. So I'm also gonna share my screen because I made a few slides that might just make it easier to follow what I'm gonna be talking about. Okay. It always takes a little while. Okay, no, this doesn't work yet. Just a second. Okay, here we go. So I started this work triggered by Michael. Actually, one day, Michael wrote to me and reached out asking about the stress research that I do, and said, stress and empathy research actually, and said, could you imagine looking at your constructs and your ideas in the context of war-related trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder? And we had several great meetings in which we brainstormed on how this work could look, and Mike even came to see me in Leipzig. And it has ever since been such an insightful and inspiring cooperation that has also been supported by Beyond Conflict. And I want to show you a little bit, just a tiny glimpse into this work to, I guess, in a way, underline this idea that empathic processes may bear an important link with peacemaking. So in general, we constantly need empathic processes to navigate the social world, right? Both on a small scale in our personal relationships, but of course also on a large scale in relationships between countries and diplomacy in general, and in peacemaking. And in general, empathic abilities are considered to be a soft skill that can only be helpful, right? But there are subtle differences. So let's take, for example, empathy and compassion, that most of you likely are using as synonymous constructs. Empathy, however, this should have come earlier, empathy is defined as the sharing of another person's pain, sometimes even the excessive sharing of another person's pain. And it's thus a somewhat self-related emotion. And if you look at empathy in the brain, essentially the correlates of empathy, when you are feeling it in the brain, those are pain-related areas. And very much relatedly, people who have empathic feelings over long periods of time, who work in a context where empathy is just a necessary soft skill, they often experience burnout, depression, and even social withdrawal. Compassion, on the other hand, does go beyond empathy in that it generates what we call the wish for the suffering individual to be relieved from its suffering. So in that sense, compassion is an other-related emotion. And if you look at it in the brain again, if you put somebody in a state of compassion, or the person puts themselves into the state and you have them lie in the scanner, what you can see is reward activation. So activation in reward areas of the brain that are completely independent from the pain areas that you see in empathy. On a behavioral and long-term level, the correlates of empathy are well-being, good health, and pro-social action. Now, this is really to show and to illustrate this clearly. These are brains, right? And what you see in blue are the brain regions that are activated if people train empathy. In red, you see the brain regions that are activated when people train compassion. So on the one hand, there's regions like the insula or the mid-cingulate cortex in empathy, And in compassion, it's the ventral striatum that is really important for reward, and the anterior cingulate cortex, for example. Now, in the work that I want to show you, and that I've talked about before, and that Michael has been implicated in, what we did is recruit almost 100 refugees and migrants who had come to live in Germany, who came from Arabic-speaking countries. Most of them came from Syria, also from Egypt, Libya, Morocco, or Saudi Arabia. And we asked them about their trauma experiences. And what you can see here is that both of these groups, the migrants is not quite as much, but also, and the refugees quite a lot, had considerable trauma exposure. So they came with a load of very taxing experiences. And many of them also showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So what we did with these participants is to do a behavioral task to assess how empathic and compassionate these people were. And then we related their empathy and compassion levels to their PTSD and trauma levels. And what we showed, or what we see, is that those who come with low compassion levels, those are the ones who show the strongest link between trauma and post-traumatic stress disorders. So in these people, trauma is a strong risk factor for the development of PTSD. With average levels of compassion, the link is still there, but somewhat weakened. And with high levels of compassion, the link is almost gone, and the levels of PTSD overall are much lower. So compassion is a resilience factor if you experience trauma or severe stressors in the development of PTSD. Why is that important? Because we think that fostering compassion after trauma, or preventatively in individuals like peacemakers who have a high risk of trauma exposure, this may lower the incidence and the severity of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in a reverse approach, of course, we can also assume that if we are able to identify individuals with low levels of compassion, then we can also identify those who are most in need of help and support after experiencing trauma. And I think I just finished in time because Carla is reappearing on the screen.
My apologies, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Veronika. This was very insightful, and thank you also for this very clear and way of explaining also to people who are not fully in the subject. I think this was very interesting also because you might have seen in my introduction that I think I'm one of those who are using empathy and compassion interchangeably, right? So I think that's really a great insight also how it relates to totally different and fundamentally different areas of the brain, and how it also relates totally different than to trauma and PTSD. Thank you so much. And I would like to come back actually to Mike and call him in again, just because you, Mike, you have been, or you are co-author in this study, and you're partnering with Veronika in this research. And I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what are the practical implications for peace building of the research which was just presented by Veronika? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carla, and thank you, Veronika. It's been such a pleasure to work with you on this, to be your student as I bring some humble ideas based on lived experience and observation. In working in conflict settings, sometimes it's quite difficult to translate these concepts, not only linguistically. Compassion and empathy, of course, make sense as different constructs in the English language or potentially in German, but these aren't as clear, but we're seeing different neural and behavioral processes on the other end, and that's what matters. And doing translational neuroscience work for peace building requires us to deeply interrogate and better understand which neural and behavioral processes are malleable, for who, and in which settings, and at what point during a conflict resolution reconciliation process. The question that I posed to Veronica actually came to me because I was wondering, what is that relationship between still being able to feel compassion for others and having experienced trauma? Noticing my own family in Guatemala, I noticed some folks become hardened, completely unable to recognize that the other side had gone through pain. But at the same time, the social economic class that my family came from, and many even historical documents, would be seen as being on the perpetrating side. So what does the pain of the perpetrator matter? And to what extent is that pain a blockage to be able to see the pain of the other, as Tim was talking about? So when thinking about the translation of this type of work into real life conflict settings, I think we have to go one step further and hopefully follow up studies and think about, is compassion a trait? Can it be trained on? Can someone direct that sense of compassion towards all social others or just persons from their in-group? What if I, as a refugee, showed up in Germany but was beaten by a border guard? Is my ability to extend compassion to a fellow migrant the same as my ability to extend and feel compassion towards a white German who represents the group that hurt me? So these are the big questions that we have to do to build this base of initial research, which is so fantastic. And the work that Veronica and her lab have been doing is pushing that envelope. And there are still, next step questions. And this is why, science operates on a longer timeline than conflict. But unfortunately, conflicts are something that are going to be recurrent in our next, foreseeable future. And so I think this type of research, the first step is getting a clear understanding of some of the cultural and in and out group nuances in lab settings, and then assessing if and how these malleable processes like compassion can then be translated into real life interventions with populations that not simply place the burden of telling an oppressed party to be more compassionate to their oppressor, but linking up these neuroscience-informed peace-building and reconciliatory interventions with broader social justice processes that are ongoing and are deeply necessary to also validate the lived experience and pain of those who have experienced conflict.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was very interesting. Also, because you were able to locate like the insights, right, to your vast peace building experiences and also your own personal experiences in a war-torn country. And in particular, I think there's the question how compassion is related to identity and also to experiences is very intriguing. Thank you very much for this. And with this, we come to Nafis Hamid, our fourth speaker. He is Research and Policy Director at the Department of War at King's College. Nafis, you're a cognitive scientist who is working on political violence. And actually, you told me you're using mixed methods, amongst others also neuroimaging. And your research focuses, amongst others, on sacred values and devoted actors. So I would like to ask you, what are the most relevant insights of this research, and where does brain science come into play? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla. And I will also be sharing a screen to answer some of those questions. So let me just do that right now. Okay, sorry. So yes, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to come and talk to you about devoted actors and sacred values. So yeah, I wanted to go back to some things that Tim had brought up, which is sort of this rational actor model that seems to still be in play for a lot of people's thinking on this subject. And basically, obviously rational actors, there's different kinds of rational actor models. One of them that's particularly influential in a lot of thinking is this idea of instrumental rationality, right? That we make self-interested decisions, we weigh costs and benefits, and then we make a decision based off of if the benefits outweigh the costs. You can see this in a lot of it's the logic behind foreign aid and sanctions as a tool for, whether it's for conflict negotiation, mediation, peace building, whatever it is. That's a carrots and sticks approach, right? We're going to make the costs of sanctions very high. We're going to make the benefit of foreign aid very palatable or enjoyable or desirable, let's say. And as a result, people, because of these carrots and sticks, may decide to change their policy. Sometimes this works, sometimes this fails miserably. And my colleagues and I, we particularly studied how it fails miserably. And so, we went around the world and we were interviewing, members of ISIS and Al Qaeda and PKK and Libyan revolutionaries. We were studying things at the nation, at the state level or pseudo-state level. We're looking at Israel and Palestine. We're looking at US-Iran relations, and we were seeing again and again that this rational actor model seems to fail. I mean, especially when you look at members of extremist organizations. I mean, these are people who are willing to give their lives for their belief. What is the stick that's big enough that you can wave at these people if they're willing to give their lives for their belief? And even within, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, US-Iran, there are people who we would call moral absolutists who will say, I don't care what the benefit is for us in terms of material benefits, in terms of foreign aid and money and economic prosperity. I have values that need to be respected, and I will allow myself to undergo hardship, and I will allow my people to undergo hardship for the sake and for the dignity of our values. So, my colleagues and I, we started researching this other framework, which we call the devoted actor framework. These people, these moral absolutists, these people who are willing to give costly sacrifices for their beliefs, they're willing to give their lives for their beliefs, they're willing to go to war for their beliefs, they're willing to let their family suffer, to let their community suffer. There's no way a rational actor model can explain these people, so we call them devoted actors. And we find that one of the things that motivates them are these things called sacred values, these values that are of such importance that they transcend material concerns, that they cannot be mixed with the profane. And of course, these sacred values can vary from person to person, from group to group. It could be the Palestinian right of return. It could be the desire for the establishment of the caliphate. It could be a variety of different things. An independent Kurdistan, these can be sacred values that people are saying, throw all the money and material benefits you want at me. I don't want them. I will suffer even. I will give my life even to defend these values. And so we wanted to understand what motivates these sacred values and how you can potentially, it's very difficult to negotiate with someone who holds these sacred values. How do you influence them? How do you come to a point of compromise with them, for example? How do you come to a point of peace building with these people? Well, one thing that certainly doesn't work is threat. So, using war, using kinetic efforts, bombs, missiles, when threat comes in the face of sacred values, that only increases people's willingness to fight and die for these values. So that's clearly not a good approach. We started to realize from doing all this field work was that social factors are particularly influential in influencing sacred values. But we wanted to go beyond psychology and go into the neuroscience. So I spent a couple of years traveling the world, meeting different people, and eventually convincing some extremists to let me and my colleagues scan their brains. Now, you may be wondering why they did that. There's a variety of reasons. For some people, nobody sees themselves as the bad guy, first of all. So everyone, if they think you're doing something that genuinely wants to understand them, will participate in your study. I think people are curious. They want to understand their own brains as well, and they want to contribute to science, including members of extremist organizations, if they feel it's objective. And there's a degree of narcissism. Some of the supporters and members of jihadist groups were saying things to me like, "Well, you got to check out my brain. It's very special. It's amazing." So we were able to play on that. The first study I'm going to go over very quickly. It's about social exclusion. We want to know amongst people who are at an early stage of radicalization. These are not people who are fully members of an extremist organization. These were people who were supporting values associated with ISIS, basically. Strict Sharia, caliphate. Some of them even said they supported ISIS. They were early stage, and we wanted to see what increased their acceptance of sacred values. Basically, we did an experiment where we had half of them feel socially included, half of them feel socially excluded. When people felt socially excluded, we could see neurally and behaviorally values that were previously non-sacred started to move into the sacred column, actually. And people started to increase their willingness to fight and die for these values. Areas of the brain associated with sacred values called the left inferior frontal gyrus, which only activated for sacred values, now started to activate for non-sacred values. I know it's a bit confusing. I'm going through it quite fast, but we can make sense of it in the Q&A if you want. Next, we took people who were much more dyed in the wool in terms of their extremist beliefs. These were supporters of Lashkar-e-Taiba. This is a jihadist group in Pakistan associated with Al-Qaeda. For these people, we saw a social exclusion from the out group increased the number of sacred values people held, and it increased their willingness to fight and die. It brought them closer to the edge of violence. What pulls them away from the edge of violence? Well, we found that actually a simple social norm intervention did the trick. Just telling people, hey, your own in-group members, meaning other Pakistanis, don't agree with your willingness to fight and die for these belief systems. Not that they disagree with the sacred values themselves, but that they disagree with the willingness to fight and die for these values. What did we find? We found that before they got this information, only areas that were associated with emotional integration, the part that you see there in red, was activated. The area associated with cognitive control areas, there in green, was deactivated. When they found that they were stepping out of line with what their own peer group believed to be the right course of action, that area for cognitive control came back online. And we saw it started communicating again with the area of emotional control. And that degree of reactivation of cognitive control areas predicted the degree by which they lowered their willingness to fight and die to conform to the in-group. So what are the policy implications? Obviously, the first three are things I've already talked about. Don't socially exclude, it only leads to more values. Use in-group social norms. Don't use carrots and sticks with sacred values, it'll backfire. And most importantly, I don't know if I have time to talk about it, but symbolic concessions lower support for violence and increase compromise. This is work that's been done on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When Palestinians heard that were told that basically the Israelis were willing to acknowledge the decades of subjugation, suffering of the Palestinian people, and when Israelis heard that Palestinians were willing to acknowledge their right to exist, this made people lower their support for violence and increase their support for compromise. And this was true even amongst people who identified with Hamas and who were West Bank settlers as well. So again, all this research shows the material is not the right levers for your policy decision making. It's the social. People want to belong, they want dignity, they want to feel respected, and if you actually try to use those levers of influence through symbolic concessions, through conversation, through acknowledgement of each other's suffering, through acknowledgement of each other's humanity, that then opens the door for conversations related to material concerns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nafis. I'm sure, as you're saying, we will have opportunity to follow up in the Q&A, and that will, I think your input sparked a lot of interest, I'm sure. Thank you very much to also in line with Tim to challenging and questioning with such well-backed up, in a such well-backed up way, our rational actors model, and also explaining what the effects and the implications are when we are treating human beings who are not rational, based on the assumption that they are rational, and how it backfires. Thank you very much. Actually, we already got some questions in our Q&A, but please, the audience, feel free and feel invited to share more questions. We will come now to our last, but of course not least speaker, Colette Rausch. Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure, you as a co-executive director of the Think Peace Learning and Support Hub, and as a research professor at the Mary Hawk Center for Reconciliation at George Mason University. Colette, in your career, you have been focusing as well in many different functions and for many different institutions on the nexus between peace building and neuroscience. And based against this vast experiences, I wanted to ask you, also because you have been already facilitating many exchanges between the different disciplines, what are the most pressing challenges when you have been trying to strengthen the exchange between brain science and peace building? And what have been also maybe the greatest benefits? Thank you, Colette.
Thank you, Carla. First, I want to just express appreciation to Tim, Beyond Conflict, Rebecca Sachs, Emile Bruneau, Mike, and others who are the early adopters, as you mentioned, Carla, early on. And it's because of their work that I'm a huge fan of exploring ways of integrating brain science and peace building. So what I will do is start with a few kind of bigger picture challenges and then a few benefits. I'm going to break the challenges into two categories. The first one is conceptual and the other is practical, and I'll touch very briefly on them. So from the conceptual standpoint, the first challenges that of the challenges that we face is cultural sensitivity. So depending upon how the research or program design is conducted, brain science findings may have a cultural bias, and applying them universally without really considering the cultural nuances can lead to ineffective or inappropriate interventions. So it's really crucial to consider the directionality of the research or the project design, including who conducts it, the context, and how findings and ways of implementing are interpreted. The second are ethical concerns. So using brain science can raise concerns around consent, privacy, and potential manipulation. So establishing guidelines is really vital for both responsible and transparent use of neuroscientific insights in the work that we're doing in the field. So this also includes especially consent and privacy, as I mentioned. Then the other challenge is just the practical reality of interdisciplinary collaboration. So as the speakers have already mentioned, when you really look at integrating brain science, you're looking at collaboration across multiple fields, including multiple fields within the broad umbrella of neuroscience, psychology, and even the multiple fields of psychology. There's the neurobiology, the biology, the somatic base, there's practitioners, there's peace building practitioners. Even within peace building, there are many different subfields. So bridging these gaps can be very challenging due to language. Even within a field and within subspecialties, there could be different languages, biases or approaches, methodologies, goals. So really understanding the language and the lenses each uses is crucial. And then how do we successfully work together and learn from each other and integrate in some way some of our knowledge into our respective work. And then the fourth conceptual challenges is limited understanding. Brain science is still evolving. Our understanding of the brain and human behavior is incomplete. And there's a complexity, of course, of cognition, emotion, and the neurobiological links that make it challenging to have definitive conclusions without oversimplification. And Mike did a brilliant job, and we need more of that, because that's how we can also take from the complex to the understanding in a way that will resonate with people. So that is a gift to how do we elevate that limited understanding in a way that can resonate. Then from the practical, I would say perception. I think some of us may be skeptical or resistant to applying brain science. It can be for a variety of very understandable reasons. There could be discomfort with topics like emotions and the human dimension, especially when much of our fields may come from more of the intellectual and logical frameworks, like we operate from here without the heart and the soul and all the experiences, and it's a more comfortable place. Or maybe because it's new. And when we have our existing paradigms challenged, sometimes we hold fast to those. So this is very important in building trust, is to find ways of connecting and building perception and trust. The other is practical application. How do we do that in just a practical way to real world challenges and contexts? And another practical is scale and accessibility. How do we take insights accessible and bring them out to program participants, to communities who can benefit? And also, how do we work with funders who fund certain research to understand it and make it applicable on a larger scale? And then the fourth practical is just the reality of the dynamic and complex nature of conflict. So we know that conflict is dynamic and it's influenced by a variety of factors. And as Nafi said, certainly not all are, and Tim too, these kind of logical things, but it comes to the things that are closely held, our values, respect. So many things are driving it. So really we have to look at how one might apply neuroscientific insights to fluid and evolving conflicts, and being sure to capture the complexity and also adaptability of human behavior in different conflict scenarios. Now I'm going to touch upon 3 benefits, and one is how it can provide a deeper understanding of conflict dynamics. It can offer insights into neural processes shaping our human behavior, our emotions, our decision-making, our seemingly, as was mentioned, the vast majority of how we're operating is underneath what is seen and we may not be aware of, but bringing to light this. And then another is a cognitive and emotional nervous system regulation. There are many different approaches and lenses in connection with the broader umbrella brain science or neuroscience. Personally, I've been drawn very specifically to how the nervous system responds, especially to threats, and the stress response and how we respond to each other in that context under threat and survival, as Mike said. So how can brain science be our guide in regulating our emotional processes and reactions so we can have responses tied to conflict? How can we come into dialogue rooms? How can we come together as human beings and be more present with those nervous system potential dysregulations that come from trauma or come just from intergenerational aspects or through our experiences? How can we come to know that? And how can we respond in perhaps a different way? So maybe we can then settle down an overly active threat response that can lead to violent conflict and come into engagement with each other. And then third and last one, actually, sorry, I have 2 more. Just enhanced support for the nervous system, brain, body, and neurobiology of stress and trauma. How can we address these chronic stress, trauma, and challenges, intergenerational trauma that we're experiencing, that we all have, as Mike said, in our families and our history? And how can we tap into that for support so that we can help prevent and break cycles of violence? And the last one is bringing in reduced bias and stereotyping. As mentioned before, it's inherent. Bias comes from many different factors and it's present in the room. So can we shed light on those neural processes underlying our biases and stereotyping? Can we look at the us versus them and othering? And can we integrate and mitigate these tendencies in some way to promote a more expansive-minded and inclusive approach to conflict resolution?
Thank you so much, Colette. I think this was really great to wrap up a little bit the first round of inputs, because you were able to give the whole picture of complexity, and I think a quite comprehensive overview on what actually the challenges are on so many different levels, but also the benefit. Thank you very much for that. So now we will open the round for questions from the audience, and thankfully we already received some of them. And one goes to Veronica, actually. And the question is, Veronica, could you share what approaches you see as suitable to strengthen compassion in individuals and communities? What are approaches to strengthen compassion? Thank you.
So really, I can mostly talk about my own approaches. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of training interventions out there. Some of them are even app-based and very easily accessible. So don't really rely on like a mental training teacher to be present, right? Which, especially if you want to do this on a large scale, would be incredibly difficult. So I think for one thing, in this specific endeavor, apps could actually be our friend. And these training exercises that are typically done to cultivate or to nurture compassion are very simple and don't need months and months or many hours a day of practice. But for example, one exercise that is typically done is to just visualize a person that is very dear to you and to generate positive effect toward that person, and to hold this feeling for a few minutes and just kind of take that experience in, and that is pretty much it. And pay attention to these feelings. And that really helps to nurture this essence of care and love that is at the heart of compassion. And people who are very experienced practitioners can do this not just for people who are close to them or for themselves, but they can extend it to people they don't even know or maybe don't even like, which is a very important aspect here, right?
Thank you so much, Veronica. Just because there was one other follow-up question to your input. There was a question, how does the ongoing nature of so many violent conflicts affect the development of the capabilities for empathy and compassion? From your point of view.
Yeah, I can really only answer this question from my point of view. And I think the constant experience of violence, of feeling threatened, of kind of feeling the influence of an enemy, right, is if not in an individual who is very aware and very willing to train to love the other, very counterproductive. So I do think this is not necessarily an emotion that we can expect to naturally grow in an environment of violence.
Thank you so much, Veronica. There have been more questions. Actually, one question which goes a little bit which brings us to a different track. Like there was the question if there are any insights from neuroscience which can define the requirements for preparation, design, and format for more effective peace negotiations. And I would invite maybe Tim and Nafis to speak to this point if you want to come in. What are the research and insights which can help to better think about the requirements for preparation, design, and format for more effective peace negotiation?
Thank you. And I want to, I've been engaged in this work for over a decade, and every time I hear my colleagues speak, I learn more and take copious notes. So it's a constant learning process. One of the things that we've been developing at Beyond Conflict is something called a toolkit for more effective dialogue. And it's actually trying to weave in the most tangible, accessible insights that are established from brain and behavioral science, but also matched to what we know from practice. And because, as Colette said, this is not just a lab sort of baked approach to the world. It's really how do you connect this incredible research that's validated, insightful, and key with real world need and intervention. So there is, at least in our case, a very practical document that's being developed, and we're happy to share it when it's there. I'm sure others might be doing similar work. And the other thing I'll say quickly, one of the most important things I learned from a range of brain and behavioral scientists, and there's a lot of research. One of the most important scientists in this area is Betsy Levy-Pollack at Princeton. And when she did a literature review in the behavioral sciences, she found that the biggest way to impact behavior is through norms. So much of the work we do in peace building is trying to create awareness or change people's attitudes. And she said there's actually very little evidence in the research that shows that focusing, in a sense, on hearts and minds gets to change people's behavior in an appropriate pro-social way. That norms are the way to go. And yet think of how much peace building work, isn't based in normative research and normative interventions. So I'll just say that and then turn it to Nafis.
Thank you very much. And I'm almost quite sure that maybe Nafis would also like to speak to this question. I think could also perfectly connect to what you have been saying, Tim, on norms.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, that's a big part of it. That's probably one of the main findings of our research was the importance of social norms as having privileged access to not influencing people's beliefs. It didn't change their sacred values at all. All it did is it changed people's willingness to commit costly sacrifice and willingness to fight and die, to use violence as a method for actually achieving those sacred values. So that's crucial. If I may, I'm actually going to give an example just from a conversation that I had not too long ago with members of a government that I won't mention who were engaging in conversations with the Taliban. And while talking to them about all of my research and everything, it was actually a member of the government themselves who said something that I thought was quite profound. He was saying to me, he goes, you know, the thing, when I hear all of what you're saying, Nafis, this is all very rational, very scientific and so forth. But when I think about our ambassadors and when they go out and when they meet members of the Taliban, they're too rational, again, in their interaction. They sit there with their piece of paper, they come in their suits, they sit down in front of them, they've got their agenda of things that they want to talk about. And at no moment do they realize that these are people, or even if they realize intellectually, they don't really realize on an emotional level, that these are people who have been in part of a country that's been in constant war for decades. All they know is violence and conflict. Many of them have lost family members who have been killed by that very government's military. In fact, some of them have even been tortured through enhanced interrogation by that very government's interrogators. And at no moment are they sitting there looking that they may be sitting across someone who is deeply, deeply traumatized by what happened to them, by what happened to their families, their own children in some cases who have been blown up in suicide bombings. And that person who they're sitting across themselves is not going to open up and tell you about all their emotions and all their trauma. They're going to play the same game that you're playing. This is what humans do. We mirror each other. We literally have things called mirror neurons. And we accept the framing of the other person. And I think what that person was wisely trying to get at is, how do we get our own negotiators out of that particular framing? They're bringing in a dynamic into the conversation that forces this person to have to reciprocate. And it very quickly becomes a business style negotiation, as opposed to two human beings sitting in front of each other, and at least on one side recognizing the other side's incredible suffering and trauma that has happened at the hands of the very government that this ambassador belongs to. So I would just leave it at that. It's an open question. How do you get out of that business style framing and into a human interaction with the person you're sitting across from? And I'm guessing that probably varies from context to context, but I think if you can get there, if you can bridge that gap, we've gone a long way into improving human relations and peace building.
Thank you so much, Nafis. I think this was quite well spoken and supported with concrete examples. So one further question to Colette. Colette, I don't know if we introduce you as somatic experiencing practitioner, but here, as probably somebody saw it in the chat, and the question is, you have like the experiences from the conflict zones, but you're also like a somatic experiencing practitioner. So how do you see the role or potential of somatic experiencing in working in conflict zones?
Great question. I can just speak from my own experiences and how I've come to that integration of this work. One is how Mike described, first of all, from understanding from a very basic sense of how our bodies, how our responses are under threat and under stress and in survival mode. So part of it is an awareness and educational standpoint. I think from a somatic experiencing standpoint, that was a turning point for me when I understood what was going on more so in my system when I was working in war zones and when I was experiencing, a bomb going off and how I responded after and those that were with me. It was like an aha moment for me. And it also helped me understand when we were developing programs and everybody was telling those around us, well, just move on, get over it. Let's plan the strategy meeting tomorrow. Why those in the community and myself, when I was involved, we were not present. We were not able to at that moment be present given the way our brains were functioning at that time. So I think from the somatic experiencing, there's two parts. One is from the somatic, it's understanding the dynamics of it, from the neurobiology of the stress response to threat, how we respond, our body on threat, so to speak, and our brains on threat. And then I have used it when working with dialogues, certain techniques of slowing things down, of creating containers of relationship and building connection, and trying to overcome my intellectual go, fast, do this, and using the brain part and trying to slow it down and letting the body and the nervous system catch up, and building interventions throughout dialogues. So it's both on the awareness, and then how one might integrate it into peacemaking processes so that the nervous system is more aware. And then last thing I also want to say from a do no harm standpoint, also having more of an awareness of what is not possible. So asking myself or others to heal or to transform or to work on these long-term processes, when at the moment, Mike was and Tim and I were in an event yesterday when the bombs are following, what we're doing there and what we as peace builders are asking of ourselves or others at that time is very different when you're in a triage moment. And then what might be possible when there's a safer, not always safe, especially in certain contexts, there may never be, but a safer context, what is possible?
Thank you so much, Colette, for sharing your experiences there. Actually, here was also a further question on the cultural biases. And since you already spoke to this, Colette, I wanted to ask maybe Mike to come in and maybe share his view on like the cultural biases of brain science and brain evidence.
Thanks, Carla. I want to start with what I think is not a cultural bias, but we live and operate in a society that has a hierarchy of knowledge and a hierarchy of disciplines. And in the past 5 years, since I've started working in this field of applied neuroscience, I have noticed the tremendous deference that is afforded to neuroscientific information and what I would call neurospeak. And you can see on the shelves of most public libraries and/or bookstores where they still exist, the amount of pop science that is being consumed in our society is increasing at a dramatic rate. Not all of that science is good. Not all of that science is useful. And some of that science is downright exploitative, primarily of research that has been done by brown and black scholars, by indigenous scholars, or that builds on knowledge that was already existent in other fields. So first and foremost, the bias has to be something that we in the neuroscience and psychological science fields assess within ourselves to understand when our ways of talking about issues that are quite entrenched and known to peace builders are being given deference that might not be deserved just because we're speaking about the same issues with a new lexicon or a new vocabulary. But beyond that, we have to recognize that most of the psychological science literature that has developed since the 1880s has primarily been based on subjects from what we would call weird countries, West industrialized, educated, rich and developed countries. So not all of those findings are going to be applicable. I mentioned the study on differing conceptions and neural representations of the self. This was a study that was looking at white Americans versus Chinese immigrants to the United States who had assimilated, and this was second generation. And even in second generation participants, they noticed differences where white Americans, when they think of themselves, there's a part of the brain that is active. And when they think of social others, including immediate family, a different part of the brain is active. That looked different for second generation Chinese immigrants to the United States, where when they looked at a photo of their mother, the same part of the brain where they process and are reflecting on their own identity is the same region of the brain that was quite active through in the scans when they were thinking about their mother. So there's differences on this functional processing level in the brain and in culture. And when we think of, for example, the epigenetics of trauma, there have been a couple of recent studies that I will share in the chat right now that have looked at RNA methylation and sort of in prenatal stress of mothers in 1994, looking at biomarkers of trauma in their children and the offspring. And the way that RNA methylates, or the way that DNA changes, to put it quite simply, as a result of stress exposure and is passed to offspring, was different from a village to village level. So evolution, human evolution, is actually, context matters far more than we think, because even simple things like the relationship between trauma exposure and RNA methylation can be different, as biologically encoded in different ways based on subtle factors that we don't necessarily know because of the genetic histories and evolutionary processes in different people groups. And that's not to be a cultural determinist, but actually to suggest that we have to approach all of this work with a high degree of humility, because there's still a lot that we don't know.
Thank you so much, Mike. We're jumping a little bit as the questions are coming in. Actually, here was one question which assumes, or which states that all the aspects of emotions, trauma, relationship actually are acknowledged in peace mediation and negotiation processes, and that we are not really working based on the rational actors model in this field. So the question was a little bit, what is still missing, and what do we as mediators still have to learn? Colette, if you maybe want to come in on this question, and then maybe others can also complement.
Carla, I got the last part where you were talking about the question is, what can peace mediators learn? Can you give me the context behind that?
Yeah,
I was trying to find the question when you were talking.
Yeah, the context was that actually, like, we are not really acting and designing based on a rational actors model in peace mediation and negotiation. So what is then the thing which is still missing, and what do we as mediators still have to learn? This was the question.
Yeah, excellent question. I touched a little bit on it, and Mike mentioned humility. I think it calls for us as peace mediators or peace builders to take a pause and to rethink what we think we know, our paradigms, our kind of training and structure, and to really, when we're engaging with the community in any way, is to sit and center the communities that we're working with, and to have that be, as one might say, meet people where they are. And so I think sometimes as peace mediators or external peace builders, we come in with our own paradigms, we come in with our own assumptions. And also there's an imperative sometimes to have the answer, because when people apply for funding or doing something, it must show you have the answer. So coming with humility and maybe asking the question of the communities that we're working with in co-creation and authentic partnership is what is needed, what has been helpful for you, and maybe building on the strengths and building on what already exists, and then doing a co-sharing of learning rather than coming in from the external. Because especially with communities intergenerationally, they've survived and lived. Obviously, there are ways of doing so that have been supportive for generations. So what are those? And then maybe coming in with neuroscientific insights and seeing how those match. And I would even say that with there's even some interesting dynamics of looking at what communities may have known has worked for years, may not have had a scientific study behind it, but when the studies are coming out, in some cases it's matching what they've been doing for generations that have been supported. Yet it doesn't always get that validation until the Western science says so. So I guess in conclusion, it's taking a pause, rethinking what we think we know, centering the communities that we work with, and engaging in true authentic partnership to learn from them and to build around what works, and then sharing the insights to see what fits, what doesn't, and walking together that way.
Great, Colette, also for wrapping it up that well. Yeah, Nafis, actually, I was thinking about you. Please come in on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, because I also think I totally agree that there's a lot of amazing peace builders out there, specifically working at a very local level, who I think intuitively, even if they don't know all the science, intuitively understand the importance of the human element. I think the problem oftentimes is at the governmental level, at the macro policy level, because the truth is, a lot of governments still try to resolve conflicts at the very high level through economic incentives and disincentives and material means. using things like sanctions and using things like the promise of foreign aid is still, or even the threat of military intervention and so forth, is still primary the big tools that governments will use. And oftentimes, as I said, with moral absolutists, with people who hold sacred values, this massively backfires. And so this creates a problem where you have these really wonderful peace builders who are working at a local level, building trust, being sensitive to people's emotions, dignifying their sense of humanity and so forth, whose own work gets undermined by these more macro policies of their governments, or the governments that at least they're associated with. So I think that's sort of what I would hope that some of this research is reaching towards, is maybe not the people who sort of already intuitively understand it, but at the governmental level, at this larger policy level, and sort of how they negotiate, and how they should also maybe be aware of sometimes not engaging in very rational actor type policy, whether it's military, economic, or even sometimes with humanitarian aid, right? Humanitarian aid becomes a form of foreign aid. That I would actually lump that in sometimes as being as detrimental as military intervention, because it's using material incentives as a carrot and stick approach to trying to influence people who hold sacred values. So I think this is sort of at the level at which, at least I would want my research to impact people, because I think it can undermine the efforts of people who are doing really amazing work at a local level.
Thank you very much also for distinguishing like the different level of engagement, and also, of course, different cultures which might act in different to different degrees on a rational actors model. Tim, I was wondering, would you also want to come in on this question? Like, what is still missing, and what do we as mediators still have to learn?
I mean, I would agree with everything my colleagues have said. When I started doing this work, it's hard to believe 14 years ago, when I would invite some very, what I thought, highly intelligent, this is during the Obama administration, people, some well-known, to the conferences we were doing at MIT, they kind of looked at me and like, are you kidding? And I realized there's been a real sort of paradigm shift, still in its early stages, among not just practitioners and researchers, but among governments and funders and the media and others, that, and maybe it's partly driven by our world is becoming more irrational, that we better understand what's happening in the human brain, in the human mind. So one is to recognize, if we're doing this work, that we really need to step back and say, we better understand how human cognition and emotion works. That if 90 or 98% or some huge number of how we think is below the level of conscious access, isn't it incumbent upon us to step back and say, we better understand those processes? I mean, that's just a basic sort of frame. We're still in the early days of this work. I think of this work in terms of conflict, in terms of deepening polarization and fear, almost as a public health threat. Because when you have a public health emergency, what you bring to bear is data, evidence, science, practice. You connect it to communities. Not every sort of intervention works for this person or this family or this community. And so you really need to bring these all together and say, we need to understand how these viruses work, because they're invisible to the basic human eye, right? And so one is, we're still in the early days. There's been huge progress. And by the way, this is not just happening in the peace building field. We've been engaging with journalists here in the United States who are struggling under the assault of our politics right now. And a very prominent editor of a major newspaper said just 4 years ago, I think the future of journalism has to change, meaning we give people the same facts, but we may have to do it in a different narrative form based on how our minds work and how we take in information and how we discount it and the biases that are at play. So I agree with everything that was said about humility, but we also have to recognize, and that's the key takeaway in my mind, that we cannot ignore human cognition and emotion, because we either think or feel, and that's what it comes down to. And we need to understand that.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you so much, all the others. Actually, this session, and we are not at its end, but yet I want to point out some of the really great learnings. And I think, nonetheless, it starts with like this emphasis on our unconsciousness, like the challenging and questioning of the rational actors model, which might not be as strong as 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but it's still there. And please, yes, come in as panelists. We are still missing Colette, Nafis, and also Veronica. Maybe you can switch on your camera and join us here. I also think it was great learning that neuroscience science and brain science can provide actually quite powerful confirmation of things we can observe on the behavioral level, right? And I think this refers to the carrot and sticks policy and exercising pressure on actors which are devoted actors and how this backfires. It was also very interesting to see how insights from neuroscience can actually help to differentiate some of our assumptions. I think this was in particular clear and good to grasp, like with the difference of empathy and compassion, and also how we have to deal differently with empathy and compassion. Thank you also for raising all the different challenges, from like cultural biases to the complexity of so many disciplines, which we roughly summarize under brain science and related science, and the difficulties to find like a shared language and scope among the different disciplines. Yeah, thank you very much. I think this was a very rich discussion. And before I send us and you off, I have two requests. One request would be that you're here in the pictures so that we can have one shot for social media. The other request is that you please share one recommendation against the insights from brain science, one recommendation to peace building. What is needed based on insights from brain science? Please, Nafis, could you come in first?
I think
Your main one.
My main one. Oh my
Your
God.
main one.
I have to pick one.
Yes.
I think there's no substitute. You know, people oftentimes will ask me for advice on what if I do this technique, will that increase the perception of my acknowledging someone's humanity? And I just simply say, just acknowledge their humanity. Just actually do it. Just you do it as a person. And if you do it, if you actually acknowledge this person that you're talking to, their humanity, that will transform the entire interaction. And it will, and all the tactical answers will answer themselves from that point forward. So transform your own attitude towards the people you're working with first and foremost.
Thank you, Nafis. Tim, what is your recommendation to peace building and making?
Well, I think this is be obvious to everybody listening in, but there's more psychology and biological research that affirms that we have a psychological and a biological necessity to feel understood as we see ourselves. And in that moment, when we feel validated, doesn't mean you have to agree with a person's sort of state of mind. It literally creates a cognitive shift where people begin to feel a bit more open to engaging. And that is a core necessity of all humans. You can think of it in our families, you can think of it anywhere. We need to feel understood. And when we feel understood, I think that's the pathway to get to really engage with others.
Thank you very much. Colette, your recommendation?
Okay, now I got to change mine. I'm going to say the official one. The official one was definitely to advocate for awareness raising pilot programs and research. Yet something that Tim said and Nafis said about social norms, the way to go to trying to change hearts and minds is not going to work. So what I would say is marrying or matching the awareness raising pilot programs and research, those exist, and just showing up as a human and being open and valuing each other and the common humanity with each other. And that, I think, coming into relationship and building relationships and community in that way, with the way that Nafis and Tim had mentioned, I think that is going to do more than any of the programming and training programs and all the things that we do on this side, although those are critically important, but coming into relationships in a respectful and a deep way.
Thank you, Colette. Veronica, I wanted to ask, against the background of the differentiation between compassion and empathy, what would you recommend to peace building?
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
the
one
sentiment,
recommendation. Yeah.
it's been there, and it's been like in the comments this entire time. I really think that training compassion, teaching compassion, understanding compassion as opposed to empathy is the key here. And really, on a long term, like with a long-term perspective, I think what's essential is teaching them young, going to schools, going where you can really source this understanding at a very early developmental stage, that it's just there, right? I really like want to take this work to that step.
Great, thank you. And Mike, what is your recommendation?
I've
To the
changed
broad
it. I've changed it 3
people.
times since everyone else started talking. I would say we're in a very delicate place as neuroscience researchers and peace building practitioners, where we have to be very, very careful moving forward in balancing creating healing and liberatory work for oppressed populations, while also ensuring that this research is not exclusively applied to change the behavior of the oppressed, but also to hold oppressors to account.
Great, thank you so much. So the only thing which remains is my reminder that this was just the starter of a conversation. And as it has been already mentioned, we want to continue this exchange and intensify this exchange on the Berkhof flagship conference, the Berlin Mood, which will take place in April. And there we will have a specific focus, more strongly focus on peacemaking and high-level peace processes. And we will have and dedicate more time to foster the exchange between the different disciplines. Thank you very much for your inputs, and thank you for the questions. And I also want to say thank you before I hand over to Andrew. Thank you to my comms colleagues, Nadine Francis Paul and Florian Lütke and Annette, Annette Rössling, who were really helpful and supportive in this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Great session.